I was setting up for the evening when the last two people I expected to come to my desk came around the corner and headed my way. One was my boss, which was pretty unthinkable because I was pretty sure that she turned into a pumpkin once the sun went down. The other was Frances Garland, the mysterious woman who had disappeared into the stairwell about 50 years ago and recently came out again. She'd spent about 2 weeks in the hospital, and the diagnosis was extreme exhaustion and dehydration. They said her feet looked like she'd been running barefoot through thorns and rocks, and her legs were bruised from multiple falls. She hadn't talked a lot about what had happened to her, and for once, I had been kind enough not to push it. Frances was a bit of a hospital legend at this point, and everyone had nicely, but firmly, asked me not to question her for my book. She had been discharged about a month ago, and I had been true to my word and not bothered her, as she tried to integrate back into the world. She was living with her brother, as far as I knew, which worked out because he was having health problems and liked having an extra hand around the house. I had seen her when she brought him in for appointments sometimes, a woman in her 20s pushing her younger brother, who was well into his 60s. She usually waved at me. Now it appeared she was coming for my job. "John, I believe you know Frances," my boss said. I nodded. "Haven't seen her in a while, but she's hard to forget." Frances blushed a little, clearly not understanding my meaning. It wasn't long ago that I had seen a very confused Frances come stumbling out of the stairwell, dressed in an outfit that would have been fit for a slasher movie. She'd been so confused, so vulnerable and scared that I was glad when someone came wandering up that knew what was going on and who she was. Well, she wants to rejoin the workforce. Technically, we never fired her, so I want her to start off part-time on the other night shift. That being said, she has a bit of a learning curve, and I was hoping that you could help her. Sure. I didn't know we had an opening on the other night shift, though. Yes, Maxwell has a new class schedule at college and has decided again to prioritize his studies over work. He'll be back in a few months to ask for another chance, and when he does, I would like to tell him that his old position has been filled by a much more competent operator. Do you think you could help me do that? She was using her nice voice, but this was clearly an order, so I nodded and told her she could consider it done. Wonderful. Well, I'll leave you to it. I wrote down her login information, John, so make sure she knows how to do that. She said this as she headed out the door, and I couldn't help but shake my head as she left. Gotta get home before the Rhine starts showing, I said under my breath as I logged in. What? Frances asked, pulling up the seat I usually held for my friends when they came to hang out on breaks. Nothing, I said, offering her a hand. I'm John. It's nice to finally meet you. She shook it, and she had a good grip. I'm Frances, but people call me Frankie. She glanced around again like she had on that day that we'd first met, and she had that at sea look again. Gosh, it's all so strange. I imagine it's changed a lot in the past 50 years. She nodded. In some ways it has. I imagine that some doctors can be just as insufferable, that some patients are very entitled, and that my new boss, someone who was probably a toddler when I went into the stairwell, will be pretty upset if the phones don't get answered on time and the paperwork isn't in apple pie order. I nodded. That's about the size of it. Let's start out slow. What were you responsible for the last time that you were here? Frankie thought about it. Well, we answered phones, we typed up schedules and memos, we directed guests, usually to the emergency room, and sometimes we had to call doctors for surgery or things. Which reminds me, she said, her eyes roving over my desk, where's your doctor's log, your phone list, and your typewriter? I smiled and patted the computer. It's all in this thing. "Use this," I said, indicating the keyboard, "and type it into this space. This is your login, and it will get you access to all the stuff that we need to do our job." I rolled out of the way, and Frances took to the keyboard with her hands set expertly. Apparently, this part was pretty familiar, but she looked in awe as the screen came up to show that she had made it to the home screen. They had set her up a brand new desktop, and it looked very tidy when I thought of my own cluttered mess. Wow, this is pretty neat. I never would have thought that something like this would be so readily available. Shoot, you should see the one I have at home. It makes this thing look like a dinosaur. We took a little while to familiarize her with where things were and how she could access them. I made her some shortcuts to make things easier to find. She took to the keyboard like a duck to water, but the mouse took some getting used to. Soon, she had her doctor's list, her phone directory, and we set about the usual stuff that I got up to on any given shift. We set up the doctor's list for tomorrow, we printed them out, and I showed her how to use the system so she could look up patients. People were patient with her, thankfully, and by 11 the doors were locked, and we were to the point in the evening where we were just waiting for 2 so that we could print out the new doctor's list and input the old surgery schedule into the archives. I swapped with her so that I could man the phones, and she laughed when she looked at my desktop layout. "How do you get anything done?" "I've got a system," I said. I hadn't seen Carl yet, so I figured we were on our own for breaks. I told her to go grab a bite if she wanted to, but she said that she had brought her dinner with her. She pulled out enough for 3 people, pork chops and greens and potatoes, and as I salivated over the heavenly smell, she asked if I wanted some. I always used to bring enough to share with the other girls. "I'll gladly share if you're hungry." I took her up on it, and we sat munching happily as she fielded calls, and I showed her little things on the computer. "Is it strange working at the reception desk?" she asked suddenly, looking embarrassed like she might have said the wrong thing. "I mean, it certainly isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills." "No, I mean because you're a man. Do the other men here rib you about it?" I laughed. "No, not really. Should they?" She blushed again. I shouldn't have said anything. I'm sorry. It's just a bit strange to me. When I was on the reception desk, it was only women here. The owner said he wanted the guests to be greeted by a smiling woman's face to make them forget their ills. I swallowed my mouthful of food, not wanting to spray her with pork. These days, they're just happy to get people to come to work, regardless of who's smiling. "I can imagine so," she said, looking a little lost. "Everything is so expensive these days. So strange. My brother paid $4 for a dozen eggs yesterday. Can you imagine? $4 for 12 eggs. He must have gone to Munch's because they're at least $5.50 at Walmart these days. That's another thing. Walmart used to be a place you went to buy clothes when you were broke or you needed a TV or maybe some makeup. Now they sell groceries, medicine. Heck, you can buy a whole dinner there if you choose. They're so big. They seem to have everything. It's strange to think of a place where I can find anything I might need." "Modern convenience," I answered. "Anything you can't find at Walmart, you can get on Amazon." She shook her head. It's so much to get used to. Thankfully, the bathrooms are still in the same place because I need to excuse myself for a moment. She walked over to the restrooms that were off the main lobby, and I pulled up my book by sheer reflex and started proofing. I still had quite a bit to do before it was ready in any sense, and as I went through it with a fine-tooth comb, I heard her come back and felt her peek over my shoulder. "What do we have here? Something else we have to get done?" "Nah, this is mine." She read a little, furrowing her brow as she picked things up. "Are you writing a book?" "I'm trying. It's coming together pretty well, but it needs a little more. Few more stories, maybe, or a good ending. What's it about? I hesitated, not sure I wanted my boss to know what I was doing, but she had seen it now, so the jig was up. It's about the spooky stuff that happens in the hospital sometimes. Ghosts and the way places change and the entities that live here. Kind of like the people who get lost in the stairwell? She asked. I nodded, my proofing at a standstill as we sat in silence for a moment. She started, stopped, and then started again. Am I in your book? No, I said, saving and closing it out. I thought it might be rude to just add you without asking, and people said it was something that I should let sort itself out. Thank you for that. Everyone has been so interested in the story, but I do hate to be a public spectacle. It sounds terrible. I have a friend who had something similar happen to him, but he was only stuck in there a few days. I can't imagine being stuck in there for 50 years. Frankie was quiet for a moment, looking at her lap. I pulled back up the doctor's list so that I could get started with the logging of today's cases. It didn't feel like 50 years, she said in a small voice. It felt like a week, maybe 2, but it was hard to keep track of time. I looked over at her. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. She laughed, but there was no mirth in it. There isn't much to tell. I spent all my time there on the run. Did your friend tell you much about the stairwell? He said it was spooky, like he was afraid to get caught when the lights went out, and that there were monsters behind the doors. She nodded. He isn't wrong. I was there for 3 nights when one of the monsters came in through one of the doors. I peeked down the stairwell and saw him. I heard the door open, and then he came scuttling in. He was unlike anything I had ever seen, his red skin hanging off him like a dragon's scales. And as he went down and into the darkness, the darkness that scared me so, I went up, wanting to get away from him. The longer I ran, the more of them I saw. I ran my feet off. I shredded my stockings, but it wasn't until I came face to face with one of those monsters that I truly knew what fear was. She was still staring at her lap, but I knew she wasn't seeing her sensible skirt. She was seeing the time that she had to face one of those monsters. I guess the last day. I don't know, time's funny in there. I'd found something, a vending machine, or as close as it comes to being one in there, and I was trying to fish some food out of it. I was getting pretty hungry. I hadn't eaten in days, and as my fingers closed around the edge of a plastic package, I heard the door open. I looked, afraid that it was the dragon creature, but it was so much worse. It was a creature made of long, kinky hair, with a dozen or so eyes the size of bowling balls floating in the hair. It was like a black wig full of eyes, but that wasn't all. When it saw me there, my trembling arms coming out of the machine, it smiled, and the teeth inside that hairy mouth reminded me of some massive bear trap. He moved toward me, and all that hair was blocking my way up. I was left with only one way to go, so I went down. I went down into the blackness that had so frightened me, and the creature came behind me. I could hear all those hairs dragging along the carpet, but I would discover that they were anything but soft. They, or something like them, pulled at me, tearing my clothes and ripping my skin. I was panicking, yanking away from it as I went deeper and deeper, until I saw a light very suddenly. It was coming from behind one of those glass panels in the doors that led into the stairwell, and when I stepped out of the door, slamming it behind me, I was back in the hospital. Your hospital. To me, it was 5 days, but to everyone else it was 50 years. My brother's 64, but when I went into the stairwell, he was just about to start high school. When I went in, Jimmy Carter was president. Computers were the size of kitchen cabinets, and eggs were 50 cents a dozen. I don't know what to make of this new world, but it's all a lot to understand sometimes. Her eyes were misty, and when I put my hand on her shoulder, she looked up in surprise. "I'll be happy to help you if you want me to." She smiled, wiping her eyes on her hands. "That would be very kind." We spent the rest of the night talking and working, and by the end of the shift, she was a little more comfortable with the computer and how to use it. I'd spend quite a few nights with the mysterious Francis Garland, and most of them would be happy. It was kind of nice to have a night at the haunted house that seemed almost normal. You're still here. Thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague here. Always a pleasure to see all my new and old viewers coming by for another one of my spooky tales. If you'd like to support the show, you can always take part in one of our channel offers through Fume or Aura, or you can just click on another video when they come up. I'd really appreciate it. For our newer viewers, we also have lots of playlists and other things if you'd like to get caught up. I know some of my series have been going on for quite a while. If you'd like to get my latest book, there's a link down below that'll take you to my Amazon page. Towesey Homestead just came out, so if that's something you'd like to get your hands on, go ahead and have a look down there. If you'd like a signed copy, you can go ahead and email me from my email address on the site, and I'll get with you about shipping information and ship you a signed copy. If you'd like to support the channel in a more monetary fashion, we also have membership through YouTube, and we've got a Patreon that you can get the information for in the description. We have lots of tiers and everything to suit your needs. Patrons that support on the $10 tier, that's our Ghostly Reader tier, get a book anytime I write one, signed and on their doorstep. As you may have noticed, there's a list of patrons and members on the screen, and I'd like to personally thank every one of them for taking a hand in the future of this channel. Well, that's enough for tonight. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.